This October, Michael Downs will be teaching a month-long course at the Portal focused on the work of Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and the technological singularity. To learn more or to sign up, check the links in the description, and I hope to see you there. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Chris Cutrone, friend of the channel. He's been on several times before. Today we're going to be discussing his article, Socialist Unity. I will leave a link in the description to that article if you haven't read it yet. Highly recommended, but this conversation will be unpacking certain things. And where I want to start, Chris, is where you start out, is who you are writing this for. Who is this article for?
Yes.
You say in the opening, socialist intelligentsia. So let's unpack what that means and what the consequences are for the article as a whole.
Okay, so I'm an old-fashioned Marxist, we might say, right? And so I do refer back to the origins of the movement. And so from a Marxist perspective, the socialist movement originates in the intelligentsia as an intellectual current. That there are two movements that merge in the late 1800s. So there's the labor movement or the workers' movement, and then there's the socialist movement. And, I think that Marx and Engels talk about this in the manifesto, that a certain portion of the bourgeoisie, defects to the proletariat. And that's who they have in mind. They have in mind the socialist intelligentsia and them being members of the bourgeoisie. And this is not like a strictly sociological thing that Marx and Engels are doing. It's a complicated idea of bourgeois and proletarian. But that's, what I have in mind. In other words, my project in Platypus for 20 years now has been based on the idea that the left is an intellectual phenomenon. In other words, it's not a practical phenomenon. It's not really a political phenomenon. It's an intellectual phenomenon. It's an ideological phenomenon. And I also like to point out that as far as the critique of bourgeois ideology is concerned, for Marx and Engels, the highest form of bourgeois ideology was socialism, was communism. So that's bourgeois ideology. And insofar as the working class adopted that, it was bourgeois ideology. So it's very different from the way people normally think about these things. They normally think bourgeois ideology means that you shop till you drop, you're in commodity fetishism as some kind of consumer. That's not what's meant. What's meant is that the ideology of the bourgeois revolution continues in the socialist movement, and very directly. Like that there's a direct connection between bourgeois radicalism and the emergence of socialism as an ideology in the 19th century. And Marx and Engels themselves are examples of this. So there's the sort of historical roots, and then there's the present situation. And the present situation is that there isn't an organized working class for socialism. There are socialist intellectuals. Nominally. They're as socialist as any socialist has ever been, starting in the late, in the early 1800s, I should say, in the early 19th century.
Okay.
Everyone who thinks of themselves as a socialist today is some variety of that.
Well, it brings me to a split that has been alive for me for quite some time, but more and more salient as the years go on, which is that when I try to collaborate with people outside of a traditional liberal academic background, it's very hard to find people who spontaneously resonate with Marxism, socialism, communism, right? So I just want to emphasize that there's lots of socialist intellectuals, but it's hard to find people who are both socialist intellectuals and part of an actual working class movement. So this rift is to me enormous. And I think that this goes to the heart of many things that are going on in our cultural moment today, which is, when I see people speaking on behalf of what Marxists would think of as the working class, oftentimes it manifests in things like unity around religion, unity around nationalism, unity
Yeah.
around markers of identity.
Yeah.
And we could extend that. We can extend that to woke subjectivity with markers of identity, but
Yes.
not necessarily organized around anything that a traditional Marxist or an old-fashioned Marxist like yourself would see as socialism, communism. So, what are the ethics of navigating that rift and that split? Because to me, that's just enormous.
It is enormous. So Socialist Unity, the article was published in Sublation magazine. The very first article I ever published with Sublation was called Dogmatization and Thought Taboos on the Left. And it was a talk that I gave in New York at the launch event for Sublation back in 2022. And I pointed out there that, looking at the audience, it was a packed house, maybe a couple of hundred people. Um, I wish that I could say you're proletarian socialist revolutionaries, but no, you're petty bourgeois radicals, right? And Norman Finkelstein, who was on the panel with me, objected. He said, "You sound like myself when I was a Maoist back in the 70s. You're denouncing the petty bourgeoisie." And he really kind of like was triggered by it. And then Kuba, was also on the panel. He said, "Oh no, Chris is just describing the reality." So there is, there though in that article I pointed out that the left sees the working class as an object, not a subject. And so,
As an extremely problematic object, and not in the sense of paying attention to the internal antagonisms of the working class and trying to think with those antagonisms, but seeing the working class itself as kind of like an objectification that's in the way of their perhaps liberal bourgeois fantasy.
that's right. Or, their socialist fantasy or their communist fantasy, right? So they have a kind of a
Yeah,
fantasy object, we might say, the proletariat, and then it disappoints them. And, we are in the, well into the 21st century now. We're still captive to a kind of 60s and 70s new left problem, which is that they dealt with the working class no longer being the proletariat as a revolutionary subject. And so they went in search of other revolutionary subjects. So it was peasants, or it was women, or it was minorities, or as
yeah,
colonized people, or as the lumpen proletariat, or it was queers, right?
yeah,
And, the most oppressed or the most revolutionary, this is, of course, not at all Marxist,
right.
although they had some capacity to refer back to things from the 1930s, from the Stalinist era, from the 1930s Popular Front era, where the Stalinists used a kind of pseudo-Marxist rationale to say, well, Marxists are not just economists, and, we don't only care about exploitation, we also care about oppression. So there's the whole anti-oppression versus anti-exploitation idea. And they had Lenin to quote. They had Lenin saying, a revolutionary socialist is not a trade union secretary, but a tribune of the people. Championing the all the oppressed, and not just a narrow workerist kind of perspective. That's fine. I agree with Lenin on that. But the point is that the working class was meant to lead the oppressed, right? So it was meant to take the lead in petty bourgeois struggles for against oppression, for democracy, this kind of thing.
Can I just say that when
Right.
I listen to intellectual thought leaders on the populist right, who I think we should be listening to, thinking with, but someone like specifically Jordan Peterson, when they think of Marxism, when they think postmodern neo-Marxism, I think this is important because I think
Mm-hmm.
we should actually confront the signifiers that people are using in podcasts and the way Marxism
Yeah.
often gets interpreted through certain lenses today.
Yeah.
I think that when he says postmodern neo-Marxism, I think that when he thinks about Marxism, I think he's thinking about the form of Marxism which has lost its own memory of itself and which is colored by the 1960s subjectivity, which is looking for the revolutionary subject in the third world, in the queers, in the minorities, which you're saying is not Marxism. And I think that this is at the core of where a real conversation can't take place yet. I would
Yeah,
argue.
that's right. No, it's all very premature at this point. And so, you know, I think that I write in the article that the working class is actually divided. And the reason it's actually divided is that capital is actually divided. And the working class is tied to capital. The working class has an interest in capital, and capital is divided, and therefore the working class is divided. And that the goal is to unite the working class against capital, but we start out with a divided working class. Now that's one problem. The other problem is the socialists, right? So like socialist unity, what would it mean for socialists to unify, and what would be the basis for socialists to achieve any kind of operational unity? And so that's why I said, look, the millennial left moment seemed to have been characterized by an attempt to unify the socialist left, but founded on the formulations of it. So like left unity became DSA, and then they have a faction within called Marxist Unity, Cosmonaut magazine, and then they had another faction, Class Unity, that left, right? And that they're these are the options. And I said, well, problem is class unity. It ends up being a PMC problem. It ends up being these PMC people angsty about the fact that they're not really part of the working class, and just devolving into policy wonk type debates among themselves or theorizing. Marxist unity just turns into a very bizarre debate about Marxism, and left unity just becomes a adjunct to the Democratic Party, right? Because the colloquial definition of left, and we're dealing with it now in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, left just means Democrat. And years ago, I debated Benedict Cryptofash, a kind of anti-left Marxist, saying the left is always the left wing of capitalism. That's true. That's true. The left just means Democrats or Labor or SPD or the Socialist Party in France or what have you. That's true. However, I still want to, however quixotically, hold on to this idea of a Marxist left, meaning the idea of a left within Marxism, especially because we are dealing with the fact that we have to handle the legacy of the 20th century and the fact that Marxism became part of the right, according to Leszek Kolakowski. Right? Stalinism is right-wing Marxism, and social democracy is right-wing Marxism. In other words, there was a split in Marxism between the left and the right, and I want to
I've heard
champion
you
that.
say before, I've heard you say before that the left and the right reproduce themselves, not like the left and the right reproduce themselves differently within capitalism and socialism. Stalinism is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. It does. So it reproduces itself. But again, it all depends on what we mean by the left and the right. The left and the right are not groups of people, they're ideological tendencies. And so, of course, people can move on the and there's a spectrum, but there's nonetheless a kind of a actual difference between the left and the right in this respect. The left represents potential and possibility, the right represents adjusting to the status quo. And the radical right is tricky because really there you have like a kind of pseudo radicalism. The radical right claims to want to really change things, but then, of course, at the end of the day, they have to adapt to capitalism, like Nazism being the perfect example of that, or Mussolini fascism. They claim to be far more utopian in their reactionary utopia than in practice they were. In practice, they preserved capitalism without many major changes to it. So this is the problem, right? But the socialist intelligentsia, I mean, again, because I would say that there's been an attempt at unity, but there's also been this angst about like, oh, but what about the working class, And so it's like, okay, put your money where your mouth is. So with my campaign for a socialist party, I'm basically throwing down the gauntlet to the socialist intelligentsia and saying, do you really want to build a working class movement for socialism? And if you do, then there's a basis for us to unify around that. If you want to argue ideology forever, if you want to spend the rest of your life in the fine points of theory, you waste your life, of course. But if you want to do something else, here, I've got an option for you.
Can I present to you what I see as a contemporary antagonism and get your feedback on it? That's
Uh-huh.
specifically around this, throwing down the gauntlet, and do you really want to do this? Okay, so of course, recently there was the I want to throw out the recent Tommy Robinson Unite the Kingdom march on the
Yeah.
one hand,
Uh-huh.
right? In some sense, it's kind of the way Tommy Robinson sees it is a kind of throwing down the gauntlet, right? Like that's the way he's approaching it from his perspective. Now, on a more left wing perspective, you've got the party that broke from Labor,
Your
led by
party.
your party. That's what I'm talking about. So that's why I want to talk about. So your party, Jeremy Corbyn, Sultana, as a unity, they want to really the way they initially framed it when they announced it on Novara was it was a very egalitarian. There's no strict hierarchical authoritarian leader. Anyone could potentially be the leader. They're going to experiment with new ways of self-organizing. Very
Mm-hmm.
ambitious in ideation. Then
Mm-hmm.
just yesterday it breaks apart. There's some split between Sultana and Corbyn along the lines which seem gendered, or Sultana is saying it's just a boys' club or something like that. But it just immediately splits, and the 80,000 people or whatever who have signed up, they're just kind of, I guess, out in the cold because of this split.
Mm-hmm.
But it just points towards, I think, the socialist intelligentsia and the actual working class, and
It does.
what would it really take for the
Yeah.
socialist intelligentsia to come down and to actually work with the antagonisms that are actually present within the working class itself. It seems to me like no one's really
I
cracked
mean,
that.
I'm going to say something that, when I was a younger person, I would hear leftists say things like this, and I'd be like, what the hell are they talking about? So the Your Party is obviously just a bid for another capitalist party. It was like the Respect Coalition, the Respect Party, and then Galloway's party was like a workers' party or something. There have been these basically defections from the Labor Party that have been a kind of external opposition to the Labor Party, but really just want to change the Labor Party, meaning the point of Your Party is to have a better Labor Party. So it's a bid to create a new capitalist party. It's not really about creating a working class party for socialism. It's not, because it's an electoral party. And in terms of their egalitarianism and their gender parity kind of stuff, um, that's just about how the program of this capitalist party is going to be decided.
It
That's all
seems
that
like
that's
it
about.
split. It seems like if that split was really the split that broke it up in like 2 weeks, it seems again like any type of left underneath the 1960s progressive woke ideology is so brittle and so superficial that it just cannot maintain itself for more than a day. Like it
I
just
would go one step further.
all right.
And I would say it's COINTELPRO, meaning identity politics is capitalist politics. And so, insofar as the left adopts it, it is adopting an internal sabotage, a deliberately designed internal sabotage by the capitalist parties and politics to prevent any socialist party from coming into existence. So the left tends to reproduce within itself the dynamics and of the major capitalist politics and parties. So I just I think that the whole idea of like a gender caucus or like a people of color caucus or this or that, no. Like in other words, you have to a priori rule that out, because it sets up bad dynamics. It sets up, people representing, like women representing other women, people of color representing other people of
Which is
color, which is
so
just not
obviously
political.
flawed. It's so
Yeah.
obviously flawed. It so obviously pisses everyone off.
It's designed to destroy the left. Like I said, it's COINTELPRO.
Well, it's
Like that's what
worked.
it is.
It's worked.
Yeah,
That's
it
why I'm
works.
with you on the death of the millennial left. It worked.
Yeah, it definitely works, but it's also the price of entry, meaning if you want to do capitalist electoral politics, then you have to accept its rules, meaning your party is going to reproduce something like the internal life of the Labor Party, because if it doesn't, then it can't have any hope of succeeding as a capitalist party, which is what it's trying to do. And that's true of the DSA as well. In other words, the DSA cannot influence the Democratic Party unless it adopts the Democratic Party's own internal norms, which means identity politics, ethnic constituency racketeering, representational politics. If you don't do that, then you cannot have, because if you don't do that, then you're racist, sexist, homophobic, which means that you're ruled out as having any potential hearing among the people that you want to influence, namely labor or the Democrats.
And I've had conversations with many people now, intensifying recently, around the way the signifiers racist, sexist, homophobe function in our minds. Because those signifiers have gotten so powerful and so over determining of our psyches that we literally cannot think properly anymore because of them.
Right. Well, it's designed to prevent us from thinking. At a certain level, it's supposed to bring an end to thinking. And people adopt it for that reason psychologically, because if they think too much, it's sort of crazy making, meaning it's like, oh wait, this problem is bigger and different than I thought. And so, oh no, there's still racism, there's still sexism, there's still phobia. And so, no, don't have those thoughts about how deep and different the problem of overcoming capitalism might be.
So the next thing I want to bring up with you is the concept of unity.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, I'll use that as a case example. So Tommy Robinson says we're going to unite the kingdom, right? It's unity. And then your party says the same thing. We're going to unite. So the function of unity, the way unity functions, it doesn't seem like it's very hard to bring this to the highest reflective level about the way there's a country, there are two opposites which both claim to be the unifying force, but in reality both of the functions of unity are in a certain sense a deeper mode of division. How do you think about this?
Okay, so I mean, in a very obvious way, the Tommy Robinson thing, the Unite the Kingdom thing, is like a kind of discontent with the Conservative Party, with the Tories. So again, there's some kind of
Well, they hate
external.
Labour. They hate Keir Starmer. They had steamer on
Yes.
Starmer. They had toilet paper with Starmer's face on it.
No, I'm sure that they do hate Starmer. And, it's a curious thing. But so both, I would say that this is what we're dealing with in the world, not just in the UK and the United States, but in the world. The capitalist parties are in crisis. They're in political crisis. They're unable to do things the same way that they used to do them. And so they face oppositions, internal oppositions, external oppositions, right? So this is why we have like left populism and right populism, right? And so your party, Momentum Part 2, or whatever, Novara Media, Jeremy Corbyn, right, is trying to be left populist. People are saying Zoran Mamdani in New York is some kind of left populist. And then you have the right populists. And so in some cases you have, like Trump took over the Republican Party. So you have a successful takeover of a capitalist party by right populism. That's the story. Now I don't actually agree with this. And I actually don't like populism as a category, but this is phenomenally what it appears to be. This is, so fine. But what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that neither the Labour Party nor the Conservative Party are viable in the way that they once were. And so we had Brexit, we had the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage, right? But then the question is Nigel Farage isn't good enough, and so we
Now they
need
go
Tommy
reform.
Robinson, right?
Yeah.
Right.
It
It's like, and
divides.
Elon Musk is there to say, yeah, Nigel Farage isn't good enough, you know?
That's always in the background. That's to me like what I try to focus on the most. You get the appearances of united Britain, hundreds of thousands of people in the street, but then in the background, Elon Musk funding, retweeting. Tommy Robinson even said this would not be possible without Elon Musk's support. So that's immediately linking the techno-feudal structure to this populist revival. Like, it looks like it's a decentralized uprising of the people, but it's not. It's fundamentally linked to what Varoufakis would call techno-feudal structures.
It's a flash mob. Do you remember flash mobs? In other words, like it's the Arab Spring, or it's the Square movement. It's some kind of internet mediated, like seemingly spontaneous popular uprising, right? And this suits capitalist politics. I don't think that it's just because Elon Musk is the richest man in the world that it's capitalist politics. It's capitalist politics because Elon Musk can't conceive of anything except capitalist politics, and not just because he's a capitalist who's self-interested, right? But because his political horizons are pretty limited in terms of his imagination. And so now Tommy Robinson, English Defense League, this kind of stuff. This has deep roots, but its opportunity is now. But what is that opportunity? So I think that one problem about the socialist intelligentsia is that they'll convince themselves it's the economic crisis and the ongoing economic crisis that creates this opportunity. And in some respects, that's true, but it's also mediated. So the opportunity really comes from the crisis of neoliberal politics, meaning it's a political crisis. It's not just a direct expression of an economic crisis or a societal social crisis. It is that, but it's as mediated by the capitalist parties being in crisis. That if the capitalist parties were not in crisis, then you wouldn't have these phenomena. You wouldn't have Corbyn, you wouldn't have Bernie, you wouldn't have the Squad, you wouldn't have Trump. Right? So we
Absolutely.
do have to take the political character of it seriously, but also not, because it is a capitalist political crisis, also not ascribe too much to that. Meaning these things are fragile, and these parties periodically go through crises and transformations. So we had the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, a fundamental transformation of the Republican Party, of the Conservative Party, at an electoral level, right? At a programmatic level, at an electoral level. So obviously these parties have their programs, and then they have to find an electorate to support those programs. So it's still a thin revolution, like the Thatcher Reagan revolution is pretty thin, but it's consequential. But it does present a problem, which is that it presents a redivision of the electorate. So Jacobin DSA here in the United States, they describe it as the de-alignment, the problem of working class de-alignment. That's their response to realignment. Now, I'm not doing realignment politics. I have no interest in realignment politics or any of that. The de-alignment, that's a phenomenon, meaning in the neoliberal era, perhaps the working class became less and less of a base for capitalist politics. And so there's also that dynamic, the dynamic of neither capitalist party really wants the working class as a constituency. Meaning the Republicans don't really want to depend on working class votes because they're bound to disappoint the working class. So if they depend on the working class, that's electorally dangerous. It's electorally treacherous. It's not a good bet. But neither do the Democrats want to rely on the working class as an electoral base. Now, here's the really hard one. The Labour Party in the UK doesn't want to rely on a working class base. No. So, that's the situation that we're in. In other words, they want some marginal working class base, but they don't really want to take on the entire working class base because they would have a very hard time maintaining that base, satisfying that base.
Is it
Just
fair to
within
say that
capitalist
that's
political power.
fundamental? Like, is it fair to say that party politics, that's fundamental to party politics, that no party could take on? Maybe you disagree with that. Maybe party is the wrong word, but
No, you might be right.
wouldn't the working class break any representational party
Capitalist
structures?
party.
Yeah.
Well, I think that what people look back upon is they look back upon the mid 20th century as a time when the working class was represented in capitalist politics and therefore achieved certain reforms of capitalism, apparently. And they have to sort of ignore some things like the fact that the Christian Democrats in Germany created the welfare state, post-war Germany, not the SPD. And the Tories, the Conservatives in the UK also contributed at least as much to the creation of the post-World War II welfare state in Britain as the Labour Party did. So they have to sort of ignore that aspect of it. But people have convinced themselves, oh, when the working class was well represented in capitalist politics, then things were better. Like this is the DSA point. This is the your party point, the momentum point. But this is a tendentious ideological view of history and of present day reality that is a fantasy of the nominally socialist intelligentsia that really are not a socialist intelligentsia. So in terms of throwing down the gauntlet, like yes, Tommy Robinson, yeah, and Marine Le Pen, right? They're throwing down the gauntlet in terms of the capitalist political sphere. I'm doing something very different. So I'm throwing down the gauntlet with respect to, don't you really just want to be capitalist reform people? Like, in other words, don't you really just want to be Labor Party people or Democratic Party people? Like, just forget about this socialism. Like, that's just whatever, right? I mean, yes, like I guess since the 2008 crisis, there
I,
is this idea
yeah,
that like
yeah.
any reform of the capitalist system is socialism. Everybody agrees on that. The right will say that. You know, the right will call like Trump will call the Democrats socialists.
To me, the term that I've used that I found is the most honest, because I try to be honest and I try not to use the terms Nazi. I try not to use, like, I don't want to overuse these terms because they
Right,
can be overused, they can be
right,
misused. I don't think Tommy
right.
Robinson is a Nazi. Um, but when I go down these rabbit holes, to me, the term that makes the most sense is National Socialism. When I think about someone like Nick Fuentes, like he
Mm,
says, America first. Like that's his
mm-hmm.
show, America
Right.
First, and it's national politics, and it's
Right.
it's and what is he concerned about? He's concerned about foreign influence, specifically Israel. Like
Oof, yep.
these are his main concerns. He's get a lot of attention, but to me, does that not is that not National Socialism? And don't need doesn't need to be explicitly connected to the Nazi Party, but it is a form of a socialism of the nation and a cultivation of
Look,
the society of particular. And they say, like Carl Benjamin will say, Britain is for British. That's National Socialism.
it is. I mean, it is. Now, fascism as a movement came out of socialism. It came out of Marxism. Benito Mussolini was not only a socialist, he was a Marxist. And he was the inspiration for Adolf Hitler.
I feel like this is
And
such
there
a under talked about. I feel like this is like not discussed enough.
it's not. I
Go ahead.
mean, there used to
Yeah.
be the four quadrants, you know, authoritarian, libertarian, capitalist, socialist, like that nonsense, which I always hated. Because again, it confuses things. It's like, are you a authoritarian socialist, or are you a libertarian socialist? Are you an authoritarian capitalist, or are you a libertarian capitalist? Like this kind of thing. And so maybe Stalin and Hitler have a lot in common after all. And you know, maybe they do. But that's sort of a deep question, which is to say, there was a socialist movement historically that organized the working class into a social and political force that was capable of taking state power. Because of that, the right had to compete at that level. To some extent, they had to make an appeal to the working class. Now, they never had the majority of the working class. They didn't even have a particularly strong plurality of the working class. But they had to compete at that level. They had to say, yes, we also want to represent the working class. That's not what's happening now. That is not what's happening now. Um, I mean, Tommy Robinson maybe, but certainly not Trump. When Trump says he wants the Republicans to be a workers' party, it's not because he wants to compete with some other workers' party. It's because there is no workers' party, right? So it's a kind of a different problem. And also, you know, he wants uh you know, and people will say, oh, it's one wing of capitalism against another wing of capitalism. It's industrial capitalism versus finance capitalism, or it's manufacturing capitalism versus techno-feudalist capitalism, or something like that. Which then, well, what about the fact that the tech bros are now pro-Trump? And I just feel like this is the kind of incoherence that one gets out of capitalist politics normally. And so we can't pay too much attention to that. Now, nationalism, okay, one step back. What is the present crisis of capitalist politics? It's a crisis of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, not just as a policy, but as a whole way of doing things, and including a way of doing politics, a way of dividing the electorate, a way of doing electoral competition, which largely marginalized the working class on both sides. Right? So, in comparison to the 60s, the working class votes less now than it did. And so there's that problem. So, neoliberalism, I think that what we're dealing with now is neoliberalism is in crisis, it's under attack, it's having a hard time keeping itself together. The neoliberal ideology is that everything that is not neoliberalism is fascism. It's either communist fascism or it's Nazi fascism, right? It's nationalism, fascism, communism is just like a kind of fascistic nationalism. So the opposite of
From the
neoliberalism is
populist right side, from the populist, they
Mhm.
see it as communists, like that they're against the, like when they think about like the woke subjectivity or the woke agenda, it for them that's communism.
Sure. I mean, I'm just also aware of the fact that there's like Steve Bannon and people like that will say, well, the left should be as worried about the deep state as the right is,
Mm.
because they'll be victims of the deep state too. So also what they mean by communism is the state,
That's
right? So
that's
wokeism
the weird
is like a
thing.
state ideology. It's like
That's
a
the weird
corporate
thing.
state thing. And so
No.
that's but it's not terribly weird. In other words, if this whole thing is in crisis, right? If the wheels are coming off, if the house of cards is collapsing, if the emperor has no clothes, and finally people are willing to say it, then yeah, like in other words, neoliberalism, identity politics was neoliberalism. Identity politics is in trouble, and that's why it has to be so shrill and strident now, because neoliberalism is in trouble, and without neoliberalism, identity politics doesn't work the same way. It can't work, right? So Trump was elected with more people of color voting for him than previously, right? So, and he won the majority of Latinos. So, what does that do to the whole neoliberal Democratic Party way of doing things? It throws it into crisis, right? And then the Democrats are like, oh, is it because we said Latinx? Is that why we lost the Latino vote? Because we used this strange academic language? Is that how we lost the Latino vote? No, we lost the Latino vote on, inflation and immigration. So, but they're kind of fumbling through. But we do have to just understand, and this is also true of like the mainstream Republican Party. The mainstream Republican Party of before Trump was a neoliberal party. And that's why they said things like, I mean, I wrote about this. I think Paul Ryan said about Trump that Trump was using textbook racist rhetoric. It was textbook example of racism. And I'm like, and that's because Paul Ryan literally read it in a textbook in school. Right? So, like, now, so I think that building a socialist party, building a real proletarian socialist movement that would have any hope of overcoming capitalism would have to ignore all this. It would, like, really ignore it. Like, meaning, like, okay, people are going to have their whatever ideas and affinities. It's going to be superficial. It's going to be superficial. Like, whatever bigotry one encounters in the working class, one has to have confidence that it's superficial, that this is not really an obstacle. Right? So, but then it's like, well, no, we don't want racists in our movement, or we don't want whatever, phobes in our movement. And it's like, but then even if you a priori exclude all those people, you're still gonna collapse in on yourself and discover that you're all racist, sexist phobes.
To me, the real thing is, tell me if you think I'm wrong. Liberalism, neoliberalism presupposes a kind of harmonious plurality of differences, and it does not address the problem of deep difference. And it seems to me like when you say we need to include a party that has race people who are perceived as racist or sexist or transphobe, that to me would be a party that includes quote unquote deep difference. Like we really disagree on this, or like we see we like there's racial constructivists, social constructivists, and race realists. Like
Right.
and you know
Uh,
and we disagree here. Like and
right.
now like for someone who's like a philosopher or dialectical, you could say, oh well, we could have an interesting dialectical conversation about social constructivism and race realism, and maybe we would get something on the other side of it, which is not either of them, but something a
Right.
weird third thing.
Do ideology critique of it or
Yeah, but
something.
like in terms of
Right.
actual on the ground party organizing
No.
real people, no, that's
No.
not gonna. You're not gonna do a philosophical dialectical unity. Like it's like
That's right.
you're gonna have people who disagree fundamentally.
That's right. Well, they're going to disagree if you pose things a certain way, then suddenly they'll disagree. But that won't really matter in terms of what they do have to agree on. So, in other words, we have to actually build true working class unity. And the only way to do that is really with the goal of proletarian socialism. That's really the only basis. Otherwise, people will fall out over their capitalist interests because everybody has an interest in capitalism. And capitalism is internally
Yeah,
divided. It is about competition. It's about national competition, regional competition, racial competition, ethnic
yeah,
competition,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
communitarian competition. It is about
Gender,
that. Gender competition for sure. Oh,
absolutely,
yeah, absolutely.
absolutely.
I know it's something that we don't like to talk about, but it's there, right? In other words, we used to walk around very complacent about women make less than men, but it turns out now women make more than men,
Right. I mean, and
or like a
there are
large portion.
as you know, I not to, we don't need to make this super personal, but I just had a kid, and like when you're navigating with a partner bringing a kid into the world, and just using this as a personal example that can be extrapolated as a universal when anyone brings a kid
Yeah,
into the world, you are going to have problems on the masculine and the feminine side of things which are slightly different. You're going to have to navigate that slightly differently, you know, like
the
and
division of labor.
it's tough. It's tough. Those are difficult conversations. Those are left to the couple. The couple has to work through those things, right? And I think this is a relevant thing to bring up because when you look at the statistics, and people in the populist right bring this up all the time,
Oh
but
yeah,
when you bring this up on the statistics among Gen Z,
yep.
the Gen Z guys are going far right, the Gen Z women are going prog lib, and they can't, like, you can't have a couple. Like you can't have a couple with a far
On that
right guy that
basis.
you can't have it on that base. So there's something deeply, the culture war has divided us to the point of social reproduction, that we cannot socially reproduce ourselves within capitalism.
Um, as an older person, I will say probably people will grow out of that. Meaning, like, a few people will be maniacs who hold on to this kind of ludicrous ideology until
Right.
old age, right? But no. And also, the working class, I'm not sure. In other words, I'm not sure if this is a reality in the working class. Actually,
You think
when
this
I
is
think,
like more university kids?
oh yeah. And, I think that, I mean, look, it's a strong ideology. So this would be a problem again in terms of a socialist intelligentsia, right? So, I always like to joke, in the time that I've been doing this, teaching the millennial left for 20 years, it started out with if your socialism isn't feminist, it's bullshit. Then it went to if your socialism isn't intersectional, it's bullshit. Then
Right.
it went to if your socialism isn't decolonial, it's bullshit.
Right.
And then if your socialism isn't trans, it's bullshit.
Yep.
And it's like, well, but nobody was a socialist to begin with, and so that's not the reason why it was bullshit. Like that's not your criterion, that's not your litmus test, right? And that's what we have on the left. We have ideological litmus tests. And it's like the working class doesn't function that way. Capitalism in terms of like corporate management and capitalist politics might function that way a little bit. But in for certain reasons and for certain purposes and in certain ways, but not really. And so I think the working class will be having babies. Yeah, I do.
So let's go back to
They'll be getting
this.
married, or they'll be doing something.
Let's go back specifically to what socialist unity means. And I want to frame this again in relationship to, I guess, what I appreciate the most, or something that I resonate with in your article, is that actually I did work through and kind of deconstruct left, class, and Marxist unity. And there was a point in my development towards the end of my doctorate where I basically said, okay, I'm going to try and be a capitalist politician, meaning I'm going to start my small business and I'm going to try and make this work. And in that, the dialectic of capitalism and socialism has been front and center in my activity. Like, I'm trying to navigate capitalist politics for socialist politics. Now, I stumble, I don't know if I'm conceptualizing it correctly, whatever. But that's kind of where I am, practically speaking. So, in terms of how you frame things, as basically saying, look, we're capitalist politicians until we've earned something different.
Yep.
I feel like that's a good starting point. That's a starting point again. And I want to say, in a unity with you, like, it did kind of coincide with my conscious or unconscious recognition of the death of millennial left. Like, whether or not
Right.
I would say it like that,
Right.
that's kind of what was going on in my mind.
Yep.
So, capitalist politics to socialist politics, we're capitalist politicians until we've earned socialist politics. What does that mean to you?
Well, the working class can be organized as a constituency for capitalism, or it can be organized as a force for socialism. And I hate to put it in either or black and white terms that way, but there is that. And you know, now I do think that capitalism leads to socialism. Like, so another point that I'd make about the crisis of neoliberalism is that I have been very anxious since Trump emerged 10 years ago that this would be the excuse that the millennial left had and now the Zoomers have to just be Democrats or just be laborites or what have you, right? And so I just thought, okay, here's the problem is that the left is going to be, and the nominally socialist intelligentsia, they're going to be the last defenders of neoliberalism. And it is in the form of identity politics. That's the form that it takes. So they are going to defend neoliberalism that's just going. In other words, it's going, gone. It's gone, right? But I knew that that's what would happen because I know it's slightly before my time, but I lived in the immediate aftermath and came to consciousness as a leftist and a Marxist in the immediate aftermath. This is what people did with Reagan and Thatcher. They used it as an excuse, and then the left represented the old New Deal, Great Society, Democratic Party that was under assault by neoliberalism, and then it became a fight within the Democratic Party of the old style Democrats versus the new style Democrats. So the neoliberal Democrats versus the old style Democrats, and the left were there defending the old style Democrats. And so it's slightly different now, but I do think that it's like that. And for instance, the Squad. One of the things about the Squad, these were basically DSA members elected to Congress, is that they all had to be women of color. That to be in the Squad, you had to be a woman of color, and then they expanded it to men of color. But it's only representatives of color. That's the Squad, right? And really women of color as the core of it, and that this represented the socialists in Congress. And it's like, no, what you're representing is hardcore neoliberalism in the Trump era. And you're there to prevent the Democrats from selling out to Trumpism. And it's like, and the left more generally takes its cues from capitalist politics and follows that logic. Anti-Trumpism. And so, for me, it was like we can't be anti-Trump. Can't be anti-Democrat either. Like, in other words, we can't really be anti. We have to think about what we're for, and what we're for is empowering the working class at a social level such that the problem of overcoming capitalism would present itself as the next logical step. Meaning, the working class has to experience the limits of liberalism. It has to experience in practice the limits of capitalism, but really the limits of liberalism before it can be presented with the problem of overcoming capitalism, the problem of socialism. I don't think the problem of socialism presents itself. I don't think the problem of socialism right now is operant. And I think that people think that the problem of capitalism is operant, but what they really mean is neoliberal capitalism, meaning neoliberalism is not functioning, and so it's a problem, but all that means is paving the way to the next form of capitalism. Like, in other words, the fact that neoliberal capitalism is in crisis doesn't itself point to socialism, not at all. It points just to the next form of capitalism, and the left is going to play some role in that, is playing some role in that.
I think that's what Varoufakis is saying. We might disagree with the term techno-feudalism, but I think that's what
Yeah, that's
he's
what he
trying to
means.
point towards a different form of capitalism. He's saying the death of capitalism,
Right.
but is a different form. He's pointing out maybe.
Yeah, he's equivocal on that, but I think that that's right. Because I think that, and he'll say, I miss the old capitalism. I miss the bourgeois
Yeah,
subjectivity of the working class as a social and political subject. And he says it like the old capitalism still had bourgeois subject, and the working class was that bourgeois subject. So he's very clear on that. And he misses that because now it's being replaced by serfdom, by techno feudalist serfdom or something. And it's like, but wait, when did that happen, Yanis? So that just happened like 30 years ago? Because to my mind, as a Marxist, that happened 150 years ago, that the bourgeois subject was liquidated by capitalism.
are you
And
talking about 1848, or are you referring to a specific?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Now, of course, not completely. Like, we're not talking about, like, again, the thing with techno feudalism is that it's either describing like a total end to capitalism. I don't think he really means that. He means the next form of capitalism, which is worse, and which has even less possibility of the working class playing any kind of social and political role. But I think what he has in mind in terms of the social and political role of the working class is as a force for capitalist reform, not as a force for socialism. I think that's the tricky part. And again, like Varoufakis got involved with Syriza, and then he has his DiEM 25 in the European Parliament. Again, that's another bid for a better form of capitalist politics.
I think he talks about this with like distributed e-wallets where like the central banks would be able to like you'd have more direct access to the way central banks distribute money and access to resources. But this would be a new form of capitalist politics
Yeah,
in a sense.
and policy and practice, right? So
And
neoliberalism isn't just an electoral system and program. It's also a way of doing things. It's a whole corporate capitalist way of doing things, that became predominant or became central in some way. Because the old ways of doing capitalism are still there. In the economic realm, in the social societal realm, the old forms of capitalism are still there. It's only in the political realm and the electoral realm specifically that you have this kind of funny, like, I mean, look, Syriza, why did Syriza arise in Greece? Because the two main parties, PASOK and New Democracy, were in crisis. They couldn't get it together, so Syriza came in and basically replaced PASOK. And then the question was,
so
is
you
Golden Dawn going to replace New Democracy or something, right? The way, like, I don't know, is Tommy Robinson going to replace Boris Johnson? No.
well, I think with that, what I wanted to say about that is that I've been working on a innovation of that Zizikian joke about I would sell my mother into slavery to see V for Vendetta 2. Because Zizek always frames that as a message to the leftists about revolutionary thought.
Yeah,
But I would want
yeah,
to
to
frame
see
it to
what
Tommy
comes after.
Robinson. But I would
Uh-huh.
frame it to Tommy Robinson like you've had your demonstration, but now the
Now
day
what?
after, like yeah, now the day after, like this to me is a question that the populist right will inevitably confront, no matter how many, like we all come together and have a drink and we're British and yay and like, but now what?
The right's internally divided too, meaning I think someone was saying this about Trump. I was watching something, not sure what commentator, probably some right-wing commentator was saying that without Trump, the differences among the Republicans would be more important, would be more salient than their agreement. That only Trump is holding the Republican Party together. And that might be true, right? I think that they haven't had a good, like, I think Boris Johnson came closest to that. And I think,
To me,
that's why his,
to me, Fuentes is banking on him as the post-Trump figure. Like he's going for Trump's throat.
yeah, sure, but that's not going to work. Meaning the thing about how this will play out, it will be a change at the center. Meaning Trump is a moderate, he's a centrist, he's an ex-Democrat, he's a moderate. He represents the new bipartisan consensus that has to come into being. That's what he represents. He doesn't represent extremism, polarization. That's just self-serving lies of the Democrats, meaning they have to put it that way in order to maintain their own rationale for, why they do things the way they do things. But no, Trump is not, he's not. He's leading the yahoos to the center. And I guess he's failing to do that, meaning he got some yahoos to come to the center. But then there are
Yahoos.
other yahoos who are not. No, this is a formulation that I've written,
Okay.
and in the Death of the Millennial Left. And so, I think that Trump has shown his willingness to sacrifice the fringe right, because that's just not his thing. That's not what he's trying to do. And the funny thing about Trump also is that it's post neoliberalism. It's not anti neoliberalism. That's the other thing. So neoliberalism thinks that its opposite is fascism, nationalism, something crazy, right? Well, no. Trump is post neoliberal, meaning he is actually trying to kind of put neoliberalism back together, actually. Right? So he's saying, like, kind of neoliberalism went too far. That if we only did the Reagan version of neoliberalism, things would have been fine, but they went too far. Right? Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush, NAFTA, they went too far. If they had done it like Reagan did it, it would have worked out fine. But no, they went too far. So in his own mind, that's what he's trying to do. Now, of course, the effect, it doesn't work that way. The effect is because he didn't cause the crisis of neoliberalism. Maybe that's the other point. He's the effect, he's not the cause. Like, neoliberalism was in crisis. It's why Obama had to be the promising socialist candidate that he was. Like the New Deal and the Green New Deal and, universal health care.
Hope and change.
He had to promise these things. And post-racial. He was supposed to be post-racial. So, meaning he was actually supposed to overcome the neoliberal race politics. But then he realized, oh no, actually he has to maintain it because the Democrats need that. Right? But he did originally sell it on, like, Obama was supposed to be the post-neoliberal president. He failed to be, and that gave us Trump and it gave us Bernie.
Yeah.
Right? But Obama was supposed to be the first post-neoliberal president.
What I'm working through right now is so tell me if you think I'm off on this. So in 2016, Zizek suggested we should vote for Trump because it would accelerate chaos within the system, and that would be a kind of forcing function for a new left response. But in reality, what we've seen is that that's not what happened. That not only did a kind of centrist Democrat reappear, but Trump reappeared in a second election. And then with Trump's failures, it seems like there's a lot of energy, again, to go even further right. So when you talk about socialism and when you talk about a socialist politics and taking up capitalism to work for socialism, you say, for example, that it's for the working class, the empowerment of the working class, and anyone who has to work, who is not a proprietor, an employer, or a boss. In practice, what does it mean to take up a capitalist politics which has itself oriented around, quote unquote, those who labor must rule?
Well, all that I mean by that is we got to deal with the new situation in capitalism, meaning a change in capitalism is an opportunity. Meaning there will be new forms of work, there will be new factories, there will be new, job sites, there will be a new economy that comes out of this. There will be. And, yeah, climate change, they used to say, and then people think, oh, well, capitalism can't recover, like Rick Wolf and other people will say that this is like some terminal end, that you can't reboot capitalism the way they did with neoliberalism, that it's exhausted. I don't believe that for a second, meaning I think, no, definitely there will be capitalism in the future, and therefore there will be a working class, and therefore the task remains the same. But concretely, it's going to look different than in the past. The working class concretely is going to be configured, labor is going to be configured differently than in the past. And we have to go with the forms of labor and the working class that capitalism is going to produce. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, they're going to get rid of all the immigrants and it's going to be this white supremacist, nationalist, Christian, American patriotic working class. No, 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 no. Like that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. It's not going to look like that. However, it might be that the neoliberal cities, the post-industrial cities that led neoliberalism might become marginal. They might in the new dispensation, the new form of capitalism. Like Trump's trying to get all these new factories built in red states. So there might be a change in terms of the economic center of gravity. I mean, there will be a change. The thing is that one thing we can be sure of is that there will be a change. And we have to be open to that. We can't be like, again, with the capitalist politicians, it's going to be a matter of holding on to what exists, maintaining the status quo. And, my attitude is, I wrote an article on tariffs. This is going to happen. Like, it doesn't matter if the Supreme Court says it's illegal. It's happening, meaning the entire global trade financial system is going to be remade because the damage is done. Trump has already kicked it over. It's going to be remade. The damage has been done. We're not reversing any of this. We're not going to be able to resist it or reverse it. Forget about that. So we just have to deal with the new situation, whatever it might be, and not be freaked out that this is fascism. Because all that does is it gives us an excuse not to do what we have to do. Or
Okay.
techno-feudalism for that matter. Because I feel like, okay, techno-feudalism as opposed to what? And so what? You're just going to be resisting on behalf of the existing form of capitalism? No. This is not, like, forget about that.
I
Especially
just
because the
want
time scale is decades. Time scale is decades. Like, I am trying to embark on rebuilding a socialist movement that will take decades. So you can be sure, like right now, it's clear. The capitalism of 2025 is not the same as the capitalism of 2011, even. It certainly isn't the same as the capitalism of 1970 when I was born. And so you can be sure that 2-3 decades from now, it's going to be different than it is now.
well,
Right? And so we just have to be open to that.
I want to leave that. I do want to talk about that, but I just want to put a
That's okay.
pin in what you said about, for example, let's get out of the fantasy of we're going to get rid of the immigrants and it's going to be a white Christian heteronormative patriotic society. So
Right.
but you did say, but it might be a shift of power from the post-industrial cities of neoliberalism to maybe they become marginal, maybe people become more rural, maybe people are more distributed throughout rural areas than in the major cities. And I think that those two phenomena are linked, meaning that the production of if production shifts from the cities to the rural, I think what that manifests as culturally is this shift from a neoliberal multicultural liberalism to a more religious, more you know,
Could be.
heteronormative mode of
Could
cultural
be.
reproduction. At least that's how it's signified, it seems to me.
I mean, it could be, except look, queers are everywhere, immigrants are everywhere. Like the Haitians eating the cats and eating the dogs, that was in Exarbic, Ohio. That wasn't in Blue City, Ohio, right? That was about like a community that was an industrial, post-industrial, like suburban, exurban, rural Midwest, right? That's where they send like when the US admits refugees, they put them in places that are kind of marginal, like the Hmong in Wisconsin, or, like just have, or like the Sudanese, like, or the Somalians, I should say, Ilhan Omar, her community, which is sort of in the suburbs of Minneapolis. But, it's so the immigrants are everywhere, the queers are everywhere. So, that's another reality. That's why I use the term exurbic. So it's not even like suburban or rural in the traditional sense. It's more exurbic, meaning they build factories everywhere now. It's industrial agriculture. The immigrants are everywhere. Why? Because industry is everywhere. And queers are everywhere, and the dysfunction of the family is everywhere. It's not like the dysfunction of the family is in Blue City, America. No, 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 no. It's everywhere, right? So,
Well,
and
the dysfunctions in the church as well, probably even more so. It probably congregates in the church.
well, that's the thing. And so, yeah, yeah. I mean, the thing about like religion is religion's pervasive. It is. It's a kind of a default. And maybe immigrant communities are religious. And, evangelicals used to be very pro, and I think still are pro immigrant because they recruit a great deal out of immigrants. Like they
I've been
recruit a lot of
tracking that. There's a
Latinos.
crisis. I've been tracking that. There's a crisis in American evangelicalism, which is morphing itself into what is being called internal to their circles as metagelicalism. And metagelicalism is what they're doing is that they're recognizing the kind of emptiness of evangelicalism, and they're drawing on resources from orthodoxy and Catholicism to reinvigorate the dialogue and the liturgy and the communion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because
So
I know
it'll
that
reinvent itself.
Orthodoxy and
Yeah, it'll
yeah,
reinvent itself.
Orthodoxy and Catholicism are making a comeback, which is weird,
Exactly, exactly, exactly.
you know. Um, and it's all very bizarre because again, when we think in those terms, like J.D. Vance is a convert to Catholicism, right? Who was otherwise from a Protestant background. And but also the Catholic Church was a constituency of the Democratic Party, meaning Catholics were a solid Democrat electoral base because of the history of Democratic Party ethnic politics. And, so that might change. Um, the Jewish vote might change, although they're a tiny minority in the United States. Muslim Americans are a tiny minority, unfortunately. I mean, Arab Americans a little bit larger than Muslim Americans because there are a lot of Arab Christians in the United States. And so it's, I don't know, what this is going to look like at that level, at the level of like prevailing culture. But I also think, again, from the standpoint of building a socialist movement, the socialist movement has to be literally culturally neutral. Like, really, like profoundly culturally neutral. I'll just point out the SPD in Germany, late 1800s. So what preceded the crackdown on the Socialist Party in Germany was the Culture Kampf. Like there's actually a German origin of the word culture war. The culture war, the original culture war was in Germany, and it was Protestant versus Catholic. It was Bismarck. It was Protestant versus Catholic. That's the Culture Kampf. And the two most well-organized parties in Germany were the Catholic Party, the Center Party, and the Socialist Party, because they were oppressed minorities. They were targets of the state, and so out of necessity they had to organize. So culture war is capitalist politics, and we have to be neutral in that. We have to be on both sides of that in general. Like just as a rule, we have to be independent of that, really. And I think that's a hard one because really the issue of
That's a hard
socialism,
one.
it cuts across all this stuff though. Like the issue
I've
of
been thinking about
socialism,
it a lot. Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, like the economic and the cultural, and how that traditionally gets framed as the superstructural and the base. And I've been thinking about the culture as also a part of the base. And would you say that
ah,
that's not the case? Like, because like for me, like does it matter, for example, that like does it matter if the working class is composed of Christians or Muslims or atheists? I posed that to Daniel Tudd in our conversation, like, or for
ah,
example on immigration, like for example, like Zizek has said in his book on immigration, like why aren't more Middle Eastern countries taking refugees, like, and like I guess the logic would be like if refugees are coming from a predominantly Muslim country, wouldn't it make more sense, wouldn't it cause less cultural conflict if Muslims went to another Muslim country
they
rather
can't
than
economically do it.
uh-huh.
Yeah, economically they can't do it.
Hmm.
No, they just can't afford it. Um,
But
no,
you're
I mean,
framing it,
okay,
correct me
so
if I'm wrong, are you framing it as like the culture and the economy is kind of thought as like
base
not in an
superstructure.
integral relation? Yeah, are you thinking about it as
No, no,
base
no, I'm not.
superstructure?
No, 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 I'm not.
How are you thinking about it?
I mean, look, I have a very different view of all of this. Like, so the kind of Althusserian or what, kind of Stalinistic view, I just don't have that view at all. Meaning, I think it's all one thing, and it's internally contradictory. Meaning, base and superstructure are in contradiction. It's not about like one and the other as separate things and how one affects the other. They're not separate things, it's one thing. And it's internally contradictory, and that can appear in the form of like a formulation of Marx is socioeconomic based ideological superstructure. But then he said it's a temporal contradiction, meaning the ideological superstructure changes more slowly than the socioeconomic base, which was his way, Marx, because he does draw this connection that bourgeois social relations are ideological, they're practical as well as theoretical, and the industrial forces of production are out of sync. So the industrial forces of production outstrip the bourgeois social relations and their ideological expressions. So there's a temporal historical contradiction, meaning in our practices, in our concrete experience of the world, we're lagging behind capitalism. We're always lagging behind capitalism. That was really like Marx's basic point. Now, as far as like the ideological superstructure is concerned, it's all bourgeois. So that's the other thing that we have to be very clear on, that I don't think Daniel is clear on, for example. Meaning Islamism is bourgeois ideology. It's not something else. It's bourgeois ideology. Everything is bourgeois ideology.
And you can say the same
G's
thing for Christianity. Like if Christianity
Christianity for
undergoes a
sure.
renovation from evangelicalism to
Yes,
metagelicalism, this is bourgeois ideology.
it's bourgeois ideology. And the reason that it's bourgeois ideology is that it's trying to make sense of a capitalist world. In other words, it serves the function of people in their feelings, in their psychology, in their practical behavior, and in their overt beliefs. It's their way of making sense of capitalist reality. So everything becomes bourgeois ideology. Buddhism, it all becomes bourgeois ideology because why are people using it? How are they using it? To deal with capitalism. And therefore, that's the reality that they're part of. And it involves a transformation, meaning all the cultural traditions and religions have experienced a profound transformation in capitalism
Can
by
I ask
virtue of how they what purpose they serve now.
Okay, can I just ask the question on a topic that comes up in, traditionally speaking, it's, I guess, would be framed as Freudo-Marxist, uh,
Mm-hmm.
of libidinal economy. So you're saying that all these religions become bourgeois ideology to deal with capitalism. What about dealing with capitalism in a libidinal context? Like
Psychologically.
it
Yeah, our
psychologically,
psychology is a phenomenon of capitalism. It obviously is, meaning it is capitalism shows up in our psychology. It's sort of, what's the reality that we have to deal with? What's the reality principle that is, both an expression of the pleasure principle, but also seemingly in contradiction with the pleasure principle? Capitalism. But capitalism
I, yeah.
satisfies. the reality principle, it satisfies the pleasure principle. It has to. Like, the Freudian idea is that, neuroses satisfy the pleasure principle, they satisfy the reality principle, however, in a pathological way.
So
Right?
tell me if I'm wrong. If all the religions are bourgeois ideology in one way or another, I see the different religions when I analyze them, when I interact with people who are exploring these religions in their own way. They provide individuals with a kind of social ontology. They provide people with an idea of they provide people with a social idea of themselves
Yeah.
and their relationship to others. So following from that, if both of those things are true, in socialism, are you basically following Marx that religion, quote unquote, would just be less propositionally expressed, less directly expressed, but it would be more just in man to man relations? It would be in the species being relations themselves.
Yes. Okay. So, of course, I agree with Marx on that. So, but let's unpack what that means. So, social relations, right, are not just relations between people, they're relations to nature, to everything that exists, and also it's a self relation. And it's a practical relation as well as a theoretical relation. So, bourgeois social relations are cosmological in that sense. And the power of bourgeois social relations is that they actually can interface with all traditional cultures and transform, revolutionize, while preserving, in certain respects, those cultural traditions. So, kind of Enlightenment, humanistic, cosmopolitanism, you know, everybody's worshiping the same God, but with different faces or whatever, right? That's bourgeois, kind of humanistic, cosmopolitan ethos. Okay. Capitalism throws that into crisis, does. And what that means is that the social relations are in crisis. We're in crisis with our relations to each other, relations to nature, and relations to ourselves. Nonetheless, we still try to relate to others, to nature, and to ourselves, and we do so in various ways, all of which are ideological because they're trying to hold contradictory things. And religion gets swept up in that, and psychology gets swept up in that. But religion gets swept up in that. So, religion after capitalism, who knows? Who knows? Also, religion in the struggle for socialism
Yeah,
is a tricky proposition because I think religion in the
yeah,
struggle for socialism, it's only a problem insofar that any bourgeois ideology is a problem. Namely, does it serve to prevent the struggle for socialism? Does it accommodate itself? Does it find some rationalization for accommodating to capitalism? That's the way it might be a problem. Otherwise, it's neutral because it can go either way. In other words, religion can serve as a rationale for the struggle for socialism, or it can serve as a rationale for the maintenance of the capitalist status quo. It's more likely to serve as an ideological rationale in service of the capitalist status quo because we have a long history of religion adapting itself to capitalism. So that's the sort of default. The default is that, right? And because a kind of humanistic response to capitalism, capitalism is inhuman, and then religion, capitalism is immoral, capitalism is ungodly. All of that tends to actually perpetuate capitalism. In fact, right? It's not a reliable way. And that's why we have to be guided by different concerns, needs, necessities, and it's got to be the question of proletarian socialism. It can't be a better form of capitalism, which is what religion offers. Religion offers capitalism, but with a different existential dispensation for how and why we suffer in capitalism, and you know how we must accept that as like a kind of fate. And I just think, again, religion serves all sorts of purposes. So I don't think that the point is to actively try to enlist religion as a socialist ideology, nor do I think that it's about actively fighting religion as a capitalist ideology. It's neither. It's neither trying to like use religion to serve socialism, nor is it about combating religion as capitalism.
I mean, I haven't done either of those things, but in the Christian atheism course, I proposed that the formula of MCM prime can be modeled as God, Christ, Holy Spirit, where, where M, money, would be our God. C, commodity, would be like you die into the commodity to build more. You sacrifice yourself for the commodity. And then the more money would be the Holy Spirit. So then, like, someone like Elon Musk is just like, let me increase the more money side of the equation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, look, um, first of all, capitalism is not MCM prime. I hate to put it to you, but it's not. Meaning, capitalism is the failure of MCM prime. Meaning, if capitalism worked and provided MCM prime, then there would be no problem. The problem of capitalism is that it actually fails to be MCM prime. I think Varoufakis had a great line with respect to this, and I don't know whether I brought this up with you previously or not. So he was being interviewed, was that some like Davos thing, I think? Just this year. And he said, look, capitalism is not profit. It's not profit seeking. It's neither market nor is it profit. And why he said it's not profit is he said any tools, the use of tools must be understood as profit seeking because it's seeking to get more out than you put in. And he said organic life itself is profit seeking. Profit seeking is as old as tools, it's as old as organic life itself, meaning any form of organic life gets more than it puts into things. So MCM prime is not capitalism. It's not specific to capitalism. It's too general. Yes, the circuit, money, commodity, more money, but
Can you tell me how that
profit.
fails then? Can you tell me how that fails? Because that made it always made sense to me as a logic when you're like that to me is the logic of building a business. You have money, you invest it in
That's
the
bourgeois.
commodity, and then
That's bourgeois society.
okay.
That's not capitalism. Capitalism fails at a
So are
greater
you saying
societal level.
MCM prime is bourgeois society then?
Yes,
Okay, so you
yes,
would say that.
yes, but it's not
Okay, so then
capitalism
maybe
because
that's how
capitalism
bourgeois
is.
subjectivity maybe that's how bourgeois subjectivity relates to quote unquote Holy Spirit and God.
Well, I mean, again, I think theologically, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about like
All
God,
right, we don't
Son,
need to go
Holy
down that road.
Spirit, that it works that way. In other words, isn't I mean, that's like your weird Trinitarianism, right? Like, which is like one's weird Trinitarianism, meaning the nature of the Trinity, meaning are they really separate things or are they just the same thing? And which comes before the others, right? So which, like that they all kind of always existed or something. And then there's the new covenant problem, there's all that. So, I mean, as a model of transcendence, I mean, I almost feel like this is your Hegelianism, right? This is like the kind of the Christian atheism is just Hegelianism,
I think
right?
it's probably most faithfully represented in Hegel, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that with that respect, the Holy Spirit is the transcendence of the internal division between Father and Son,
Yeah.
right? So it's a kind of
And also contains father and son.
right, but right, but without the thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea, right? Because again, Hegel is not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He's not. That's Fichte, and that's not Hegel at all. And so it's more about internal differentiation and then supersession that preserves,
If we're getting
right?
into like the way I've thought about it is the abstract, the negative, and the concrete. So money is
Uh,
abstract. So the money would be the abstract part of the equation. The commodity would be the negative, and then the concrete would be the surplus money.
yeah, it's tricky. I'm
So
not sure. I'd have to think about it more. I'd have to think about it more because I think that uh, in the Hegelian schema, transcendence is the movement of the negative. right? I mean, this is a tricky thing. And I think that, again, what we want is to not come down on one side, abstract concrete, nor transcendent, meaning, um, in a way, the struggle for socialism is all those things and none of those things, right? So it's not about like saving the commodity economy from money, nor is it about saving like the abstract relations represented by money against like the concrete commodity fetishism, right? Nor is it just the transcendental realm, because all those things basically would be moments in the appearance of capitalism. And again, the point is that it doesn't work. Meaning, there's a profit crisis, a value crisis. There's a crisis of profitability. We've been living through it. Like since the Great Recession and since COVID, there have been these problems of profitability, of value. You know, we've been living through it, and neoliberalism came out of something similar in the 70s. And so I think that if we keep in mind that it's not like, okay, this is the system, and we want to defeat that system. Capitalism is not a system. Capitalism is a crisis of a system. The system is a system of bourgeois social relations. The crisis of that system of bourgeois social relations is capitalism. So that's that, and it's actually a very important point, but it's also a very general theoretical point that in practice doesn't show up just like that. Because I think that, again, what people will do among the socialist left is that they'll try to take sides within capitalism. They'll say this is the reactionary side versus the progressive side. Right? This is the more human side. This is the more inhuman side of capitalism. No. Right, we can't adjudicate it that way. Because then what will end up happening inevitably is that one will pick sides in capitalism, which means dividing the working class. And that's where we are, by the way.
Well, that's
We
what I
are
wanted
there.
to talk about next. I wanted to talk about the working class as divided by capital and what does it mean to work with that division concretely, because I feel like I'm constantly always right in that
Mm-hmm.
specific division.
Mm-hmm. Right. So again, why does the working class need unity? It only really needs unity in the struggle for socialism. And so to begin with, it needs unity in order to basically present liberal demands. Right. So insofar as the society is failing at the level of a kind of bourgeois liberal ethos, it would appear that the working class has to unite in order to even coherently register a complaint against that failure, in order to be able to say, this is an unfair system, this is an inhuman system, this is a system that's working against us. So now, bring it around to neoliberalism and the working class as an object. I think the Democrats believe that they are the only viable way of uniting the interests of the working class. And from their perspective, they're right. Meaning they're the only existing way of uniting the interests of the working class coherently. Now, of course, they're also interested in uniting the interests of the working class with the interests of capital, but they don't see a contradiction there, because at a certain level, there is no contradiction. Meaning, the Democrats claim to be the legitimate, as opposed to illegitimate, ruling party in the United States, because only their way of doing things unites all the disparate parts of capital and all the disparate parts of the working class. Whereas the Republicans just represent the losers and the disgruntled, right? So Obama said famously, people cling to their Bibles, they cling to their guns when they lose out in the system. Right? So the Democrats are like, we do the best that we can, we want to be on everyone's side, but there are some people who are inevitably losers in the system, and the danger is that they'll get riled up and make unreasonable demands, or they will be divisive. So basically, the Republicans are divisive, the Democrats are uniting. And from the Democrats' perspective, that's plausible, meaning they're like, look, the only way that you deal with like the sexism and racism and homophobia in society among privileged people, but really among working class people, is let us be the brokers between these groups. Let us mediate, let us negotiate the different groups. And so, yeah, we might want to do certain things. Like, the example that I always like to bring up is like the Democrats wanted to do gay marriage for like a long time. Why couldn't they? Because the black voters weren't in favor of it. And so they couldn't alienate the black vote. That was bad for them electorally. And so they couldn't do it until they finally could do it, right? But basically that was the sticking point. The sticking point was they wanted to do it. They wanted to do it, at least since Bill Clinton. They wanted to do some kind of, gay equality. But they couldn't because it would alienate the black vote too much. And it's not that the blacks would then vote for Republicans, some would, but then they just wouldn't vote. And it would cost the Democrats too much electorally. Right? So basically they're like, we have to sort of make concessions to the reactionary views of this and that constituency, and we have to herd the cats and hold it all together and whatever, right? And we found a way to do it that is socially responsible, politically equitable. We're experts at this. We lab tested in university environments. We figure out the rhetoric that you have to use, right? We market test it, we poll, it. And, from their perspective, that's the case. And that you wouldn't want to, just go directly to the working class because it's too internally divided. And so it just won't work, right? So there's kind of paternalism to the whole thing. And I think that that's where the left basically participates in that. The left is like, we have a way of understanding the relationship between racism, sexism, and phobia and capitalism. And so we're the ones who can kind of broker and mediate and manage. And when the Democrats fail, then we're there to offer a better formulation of this. Now, again, I think that at a certain level, that's very plausible and even to a certain extent true. At another level, what we've seen over the last generation, over the last 50 years, is a retreat in neoliberal politics from even really trying to mediate a lot of that. Meaning a lot of society has been left to its own devices. And religion has plugged the hole to a large degree. Again, it's Bibles and guns. So it's like religion has plugged the
It really,
hole,
yeah. Yeah.
and where they don't plug the hole, then the workers just shoot each other, And we try to take guns off the street. We know that we can't really do that, and so the workers just shoot each other. And that's what we're dealing with. Like, we're dealing with the sort of objective limit of politics, which is these workers who are losers, and we can only do so much for them. And we can't really expect them to vote for us. And so the point is just keep a lid on that shit and not stir it up. So Trump comes along and stirs it up, and they're like, no, you can't do that. You can't do
So
that.
I guess the other thread that I think we should discuss before pointing to a close is you mentioned how capitalism today is different from capitalism in 2011, how capitalism will change a decade from now. I think so much of this, if we're referencing Varoufakis' thesis about techno-feudalism, involves the different technologies involved. I just recently had a conversation with Mikey Downs about his book Capital versus Time Energy.
Mm.
He talks a lot about automation, and the role of automation, pointing towards the possibility of not just the workers of the world uniting, but emancipation from work itself.
Mm.
Do you think that that is a part of this project, or how do you imagine the role of automation and the overcoming of labor as such? Is that for you?
After the revolution.
Okay, so not part of the revolution, but something that could potentially come
No,
after.
it's after the
How do you think
revolution.
about the dynamics there?
I mean, look, we can't do utopian socialism, meaning we can't do like some new forms of labor under capitalism that supposedly defy the capitalist logic, because that's just going to be a capitalist innovation. That's going to be appropriated by capital in one way or another. Right? So technology is neither the problem nor the solution. Automation, that's what we're really talking about. Automation is neither the problem nor the solution. And so we do have to organize the working class as it actually labors now in the system. And, and I also think, by the way, that organizing labor per se is probably the last step of the process from where we are now, meaning probably now we need to do more general community organizing. And the reason for that is because we have to start with the more general discontents of the working class, which have a more kind of liberal character and are not, they might be economically conditioned, but aren't necessarily showing up immediately as an economic discontent. We also have to be wary of the fact that economic discontents can be channeled into capitalist politics rather easily, right? So
I think a
neither.
lot of like
Hmm?
I like the emphasis on the general community organizing, but like I feel like a lot of the economically conditioned problems when I hear people talking about these things, I think a lot of people just accept their lot in life. Like a lot of
Yes,
people
that's
just
true.
accept that this is the like I think a lot of
That's
people just
true.
say this is the way it is. This is the job I work. These are the conditions I live in,
That's
and
right.
this is kind of the unconscious background of my life, and it'll be like that for the rest of my life.
Right. And it will. And it will. Meaning, again, we're looking at decades. And so that's why there has to be this more long-term goal. And again, the DSA Jacobin, they have their way of dealing with this, or like Mélenchon in France. They have this kind of democracy idea, democratic socialism. So basically, the goal is democracy, democratic socialism, a more democratic state, a sixth republic, a change in the Constitution in the United States, something, right? And economic democracy, not just political democracy, but a better political democracy. So they look at it that way, and they basically subsume it under that, meaning how to address various social problems. Well, we need more democracy. That's very plausible. That's very reasonable. But again, it has this kind of general. Notice it has a kind of a general character to it. And so I think that the problem with trying to address the economic conditions immediately is that really the only thing that can be done now is the sort of that capitalist policy. So another way that I have of thinking about this is changing conditions on the ground, like changing the concrete terrain in which capitalism operates. Meaning every capitalist enterprise has to deal with objective societal conditions on the ground. And I think that that's what needs to be affected. Meaning, insofar as the working class is self-organized, it changes the ground conditions for capitalism. It does. And again, in a more general sense, not just in the sense of like labor union collective bargaining type organizing, because in fact, labor union collective bargaining type organizing actually requires other kinds of community organizing to support it. It does. And so again, what we're coming up against is really like liberal criteria, meaning civil society is in disrepair. I mean, look, you mentioned the populist right and how they're preaching like return to the family. That's fine, but what about the more general social conditions for family life? It's not like families can be self-sufficient. Families depend on a great deal of social support, in fact.
Well, that
And,
you'll see that under every Elon Musk tweet about social reproduction, like have more kids. He's like on Twitter, like he'll say have more kids. You'll see people talking about economic issues underneath the tweet.
right, so then the question is that social support just going to come in the form of money? Right. So, I mean, look, I guess Hillary Clinton famously said back in the 90s, it takes a village to raise a child. It does. And a village is not just a certain amount of money. It is not. Meaning children need grandparents to help raise them. I hate to tell you that, you know, but you need the extended family. It's hard to do it on your own. Meaning, and the nuclear family never did it. And whether it's private or public childcare, it doesn't quite cut it. Doesn't quite cut it. It never will. And so one thing that came up here in Chicago around the campaign for a socialist party, I'll just tell you this anecdotally, because we do all sorts of organizing, the campaign for a socialist party, ground level social organizing. And so one thing that came up in our tenants union organizing was community childcare, and how in the COVID era, uh, especially, but also more generally, like immigrant communities have informal community childcare where it's under the table stuff, meaning it doesn't quite pass muster in terms of the state regulations and requirements. So, people have informal arrangements for taking care of each other's children in the community. And that happens out of necessity with immigrant communities because it's more difficult for them to claim public benefits and to engage the more formal, official money economy. And so they have to come up with an informal economy solution to it. And in fact, out of, necessity is the mother of invention. Out of that necessity comes some things that are better than what's otherwise on offer, either by the state or by private entities. Socialists have to be doing that. Right? That's what organizing the working class means. It means having the working class organized to provide for itself in a way that the formal economy of capitalism and the state cannot. That's the model here. And again, insofar as that takes place, it affects the conditions of the formal economy and of the state and how it operates. And ultimately, these things have to be accepted. And religious organizations do this. Religious organizations provide social services of this type. And people pay, so there's religious organized childcare, and people pay.
Wouldn't that be like religion that's part of socialism as opposed to complicit with capitalism? It's part of it.
But it is complicit in capitalism, right? So in other words, we have to do something
it could
like
be both. It could be
it's
both.
both.
It depends.
It's both.
It depends.
Absolutely, it's both. It certainly is both. But the way they do it is rich people pay more, or people who have a little bit more money pay more, and poor people pay less or nothing. And it's done out of religious solidarity. It's done out of community solidarity in the form of religious solidarity. We need to do it out of socialist solidarity. That has to be our goal.
The tropes are we're atomized. The tropes are that we're spread out too disparately. That the online, I'm a perfect symptom. I couldn't tell you how perfect of a symptom I am.
Yeah, me too. I'm an academic, so I live in a very atomized, way of life.
All my extended family spread across several countries.
That's right. Yeah, me too. I don't live near where I grew up or my extended family, and it's bad. I have to say it's bad. That hit home. And so all that I'm saying is there are needs in civil society and capitalism that are unmet by the formal economy and that are unmet by the state. And yet, what you'll find is that there are pockets in which it is met. In other words, it's not as if it only exists through the formal economy or through the state. It doesn't. And so that has to be where the organizing for the working class for socialism, it has to begin there, right? It can't begin with, we need the city to provide this and that. We need the city to raise taxes so it can pay for this and that. No.
And so in your experience with you're on the ground organizing, and your experience networking with other socialists, are people doing that? Are people organizing communal family networks that build childcare opportunities? Is that happening?
Well, not in the socialist milieu. It's happening to a certain extent with anarchist mutual aid stuff, but that tends to be about abject poverty. So what we've encountered in our initial forays into organizing, we've encountered the fact that insofar as this stuff already exists on the ground, it's done under the rubric of either religious communities or immigrant communities. And so that needs to be generalized to the working class at large. And you know that, and again, that's very liberal. Like that's just very like liberal civil society, and it's very like kind of uncontroversial at some level. And yet, insofar as the working class as such needs to do those things, the real point of doing those things is to develop its own capacities for organizing at a more general social and political level as a force for socialism. Like that's its historical task. That's the objective necessity. So there are
Can
objective
I say
necessities.
then?
Hmm.
Can I say then, like in terms of concretely doing that? Because I mean, I've done a lot of things that look like
Hmm.
self-organized
Hmm.
social events that have
Yeah.
no institutional support or backing.
Right. Right.
I agree with you that a lot of ruptures, like, and there's social antagonisms constant, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think some of those antagonisms just have to do with money. Sometimes they're just capitalist
Yeah.
antagonisms that can emerge.
Yeah.
But a lot of the times, the antagonisms that emerge are these just singular, personal, egoic issues,
Sure. Personalities.
personality
Personalities.
issues.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, like when I grew up, like when I was a kid, I had a big extended social family. Like we and it was like the amount of social negativity, of personality. This aunt who has problems with this uncle, this grandparent who has problems with this kid. Like I mean, it's social life. It's just a mess, right? Humans are just
Social
a
life.
mess. Extended family social networks are a mess, right? Like,
Well,
and
they are a mess, and yet they do something. And all that I'm saying is that at a concrete level, a socialist movement has to be based on such things. But of course, it changes its character if it's serving what people think of as a higher purpose. And there does have to be that higher purpose. In other words, it has to be a political purpose.
what about
Meaning,
like again, the people I've run into problems where the higher purpose, and I've had fallouts over this.
uh-huh,
I've had fallouts over this where it was a theological distinction.
theological dispute. Well, that's the thing. And
It's the
I don't want
theopolitical.
to, yeah,
It's
I
the
don't want to
theopolitical.
be like cultivating a priestly dispute or a would-be priestly dispute among Marxist theologians, right? And so that's just a different thing. I mean, actually, that's where it does train people to be capitalists, doesn't it? Like it trains people to start churches that are run like good businesses.
Because I think that capital, when you encounter like, I feel like social negativity can be worse than death sometimes. Like people treat it like that. Like people would like concretely, people like you encounter a social negativity, and you say, "There's irreconcilable," and I would just rather be separate until death than resolve this.
Or
And
the other side of it is I'd rather stay in this community because leaving it seems like a fate worse than death.
I guess it can go both ways, but I
Don't
think
you think?
that I think yes, I've seen both. I think that when extended family networks are strong, the latter is true. What you just said is true. And when it's what I was said is true, I think you get the atomization.
Yeah.
So
No, I mean, look, I'm not
it's the social
saying,
negativity. It's the
again, it's
but
a
I want
chicken
to say
or egg
one thing,
paradox.
see if you
Hmm.
agree. The social negativity,
Hmm.
I think that people will go to capitalism because when it's just the pure capitalist reproduction, in many ways, if you're successful with that, you can avoid some social
Yeah, it frees
negativity
you
that
from
otherwise
that.
you wouldn't have to
It
put up with.
absolutely, it
It frees you
frees you
from
from
that.
all
It
that
frees you
shit.
from.
Yeah, capitalism, well, a bourgeois society is freeing. And that's where I'd put it at the level of bourgeois society, meaning that kind of culturally neutral, purely business approach to things, or purely practical approach to things, purely pragmatic approach. I think that's also something that the socialists have to get good at, rather than succumb to personality in the guise of, in the form of theology disputes. Right. So on the left now, we have that in the form of theoretical ideological disputes, and that's why I've always known that it's just sort of bullshit at a certain level, because it's real only at an interpersonal level. It's not real at a substantial level. It
I've
suggests,
heard
plausibly it
I've heard someone
suggests.
make the distinction between the intellectual distinctions and like an embodied difference, like an embodied disagreement.
Well, I'd be tricky. I think that I would be wary of that, because I think that's super tricky, because I think, that wouldn't account for, that doesn't really account for the way people change ideologically, because they do. Like, individuals, their own like process. I think that kind of ontologization of difference is very treacherous, and it's standpoint
Okay.
epistemology type stuff.
So do you, I guess maybe I feel like it's a
Embodiment's
big
pretty reactionary.
I've
Embodiment's pretty reactionary.
well, most forms of embodiment discourse are reactionary. What I mean when I say embodiment, I'm more talking about the social body.
You mean what community you're part of?
Yeah, and I'm just saying that, like, for example, I feel like I've cultivated a capacity where I can talk to people who have a lot of different worldviews. Like, I can entertain many different worldviews. But like, if
Sure.
we're talking about like how the day-to-day operations with me and my kid are, like with the people, like with someone in my extended, like, someone, if there's like, that's what I mean by an embodied disagreement, like something about the intimate social body, and I think the model for this is just the intimate partner relationship, and then the intimate partner relationship, and then it scales up or scales out at different levels. And I think different people have different capacities to handle social negativity, and I think we can train ourselves with that.
Mm-hmm.
um, but
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't know if we're losing the skill, but I think the people who are going to religion are trying to work on that skill, whether they're consciously reflecting on it in that way or not.
Yes. It's a funny it's a funny thing, because originally I think religion would have been the expression of real social relations, whereas now religion is being used to try to repair social relations.
Yes, yes, that's what I see as well. So, I mean, this has been a
And
discussion on your article, Socialist Unity, and I just give you the last word in terms of, um, yeah, what you want out of this article. Again, it'll be linked in the description,
thank
how
you.
people should read this article, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Um Again, I do think that would-be socialists have to ask themselves, where do they want to invest their energy, their time? What is their actual commitment to socialism? What is it about? And I think that, it's a perennial need, and yet this is also a good moment. It's a kind of a crossroads, second Trump term in the United States here. Are you going to just sacrifice yourself to capitalist politics, or are you going to take a different road? Um, are you, what do you want your contribution to amount to 20 years from now? And I'm proposing that we discipline ourselves to the needs of constituting a working class social movement whose political needs will arise as they do in the course of developing that movement.
But a party, not just a movement. Am I?
Yeah, I do ultimately, but it's, so my project that I'm part of is the Campaign for a Socialist Party. It's Campaign for a Socialist Party, so it's not like we're not declaring that we're a socialist party, but that is the end goal. But also I have faith that any movement, when it attains a certain level of social power, is presented with political problems that force it to become a political party. And so, obviously, people who are against forming political parties are probably not going to be part of this. Um, on the one hand. Uh, but again, I would say let's be agnostic about how these problems have presented themselves in the last century, because we have a lot of dead ends. We have a lot of debris. We have a lot of failure, bad examples, and we need to really get back down to basics and have an exploratory, experimental, open-minded attitude that is disciplined by practice, not by theory. So this is a very different, I always like to say this, there's a very different side of me than people are used to. People are used to the hyper esoteric Marxist intellectual Chris Cutrone. This is a different side of me. This is the organizer side. And it's just a different set of needs. So the needs of Marxist theoretical clarification are very different from the needs of a working class social movement.
So last question on a personal level, on an organizational side level, how do you relate to social negativity? How do you navigate and work through social negativity? Are you good at that? Do you see yourself as someone who can model that well? Have you had do you have your own problems with, just going separate ways, or are you pretty good at how do you feel with being in that practical social negativity?
I mean, at a personal level, unfortunately, I'm sensitive, I take things personally, I do. I try not to, but I do. Especially at the level of like trust. So I think that trust has to be built practically with people. Um, I generally give people the benefit of the doubt and extend trust to them until there's reason not to. Um, and I expect to be treated that way. In other words, I expect to be treated without more suspicion than is warranted, or more skepticism even than is warranted. And I do think we have to be disciplined not by just interpersonal trust, but by trust in what we're trying to do together. And that has worked for me, meaning I have organized 500 or 600 people across the world in Platypus over 20 years, and maybe maybe more than that based on people who have drifted away or quit along the way. Um, and we've had our controversies like any leftist organization. We've had internal controversies, we have. And, I've always been interested in giving people the benefit of the doubt, being forgiving, um, you know, allowing for disagreement, differences, and really putting the common project above my personal feelings or opinions. This is basic stuff, but it's true that people struggle with that people have
Yep,
difficulty with that. But
they do.
I think the main difficulty is the character of the common purpose. I think that people have a hard time holding on to the common purpose. We have to serve something larger than ourselves. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. Meaning, I do this stuff out of a sense of duty, not out of a sense of ego. Because, I, whatever, I don't have a
I
very
mean, you could
high.
be watching Star Wars. You could be watching Star Wars right now.
Exactly,
Like, okay,
exactly, absolutely. I could be making Legos. I mean, look, I don't like estimate my own ego more than, I reasonably can, I know my own limitations. So I'm doing what I can. I'm making the contribution that I can out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of, what, if I don't do it, no one else will. And, or, I do have something to contribute, and so I ought to contribute it, and that's where it comes from. And, this is my higher self at work, and I think that, people do have to check themselves that if they are just reveling in a kind of debased ego struggle problem, if they're just, doing it out of some kind of personality compulsion and not out of a sense of serving something higher than themselves, then they ought not to. Meaning you do have to check yourself. You just have to say, why am I so invested in this argument or this debate or this struggle. If it's because you just feel the need to express your ego, yeah, that's not a good motive. It's not. You got to have a sense of, I'm really doing this for others and for a higher purpose. That's the only, and you have to discipline yourself to that. You have to, say, okay, I'm not just going to indulge myself, and I'm not going to act in such a wounded way that I cannot help but sort of indulge myself. I really have to be better than myself in this domain.
Well, this has been Cadell Last with, dare I say, Marxist theologian Chris Cutrone.
Preaching to the converted.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks a lot.
This October, Michael Downs will be teaching a month-long course at the Portal focused on the work of Nick Land, Slavoj Žižek, and the technological singularity. To learn more or to sign up, check the links in the description, and I hope to see you there.